I mean, I think what interests me most about the trope is just its potential for, like, narrative engagement. It grabs people's attention, but it also just changes the way people might engage with the media.
Because it's more personal, you mean?
Yeah. We all like when a game or movie or whatever it makes us feel seen, I think, but even when we don't necessarily connect with it ourselves, breaking the fourth wall can still be really effective at getting the story's message across. One of the hardest things for a game that's trying to say something is, like, making the audience listen, getting them to take it seriously. And that's all well and good when you're watching the characters tell a story, but isn't it so much more convincing when they're telling it to you? So, fourth wall breaking in media. It's a phenomenon that has become a lot more normalized over time, especially in the last few decades, but it's still unusual enough that it's treated as transgressive. The norm, particularly in drama and in works that aim for traditional respect and acclaim from critics, is to tell the story in a way that pretends the audience isn't there at all. This is a concept that gets a little fuzzy when you apply it to video games. On the stage or the movie screen, the line between the actor and the audience is distinct. Yes, as a viewer, your mind may be engaged, you may be consuming and analyzing everything you see and hear, but you are still just that, a viewer. There's a clear line separating those who see from those who do. As a gamer, though, you influence the events more directly. That doesn't necessarily mean you have free reign over the game world, but you're still a participant in the story, in the same way an actor who recites his lines word for word is a participant in the play. As Stephen Conway phrases it, a player is fulfilling the dual role of audience member and performer on stage. And when you happen to be looking at the fourth wall from both sides at the same time, acknowledging it starts to feel less like breaking it and more like constructing it. But let's back up a second. What does this actually look like? In games with no acknowledged distinction between player and player character, it's pretty simple. Either the player character is you, these are situations where you can give them your name, your appearance, your personality, or you are the player character. These are situations where the PC is a character of their own, but you're intended to empathize with them, to embody them, to put yourself in their shoes. I mean, what more effective way of putting an audience member in a character's position than by making it so the viewer can literally control them? You become responsible for how they move, what choices they make. Even if the PC is nothing like you, that creates some pretty immediate identification. In many games that break the fourth wall, though, the player is made undeniably aware that they are not, in fact, the player character. Often this is done by direct address. The game itself, or a character within it, starts talking about the PC in third person, they, and the player in second person, you. Implementations like this bring into focus the reasons for the common idea that breaking the fourth wall damages narrative enjoyment by breaking immersion. It's alienating to be spoke to in this way by the narrative, especially when a player may have spent hours making an effort to feel like they're within the story. Immersion and narrative enjoyment are often equated. In order to be enjoying the narrative, one must be immersed within it, and if one is immersed in the story, one is likely enjoying the narrative. But what the immersive fallacy overlooks is that sensory immersion isn't the only way to be narratively engaged. Use of language like transported into the story, with an emphasis on how a viewer might lose track of time or their sense of place, falsely implies that the only way for a story to meaningfully impact its audience is for the audience to forget that it's a story in the first place. Similarly, the over-prioritization of sensory immersion in games implies that a player must feel within the game world, and if they were to be reminded that they are without the game world, the story would lose value. This is where Eva Widger's concept of immersive storytelling comes in, that being immersive with an E and not immersive with an im. Widgers defines immersive storytelling like this: a method of storytelling in which the fictionality of the medium is acknowledged, derived from the verb to emerge, to come forth into view from concealment or obscurity. Where immersive storytelling demands the player become lost in the woods of the narrative, immersive storytelling uses the trees to show the player the forest. Immersive storytelling seems to encourage passive participation from its audience, the same level of critical analysis in play that a person has in their day-to-day life. Emersive storytelling, as Widgers puts it, demands active participation from the viewer and triggers critical thinking, both about the message of the story, and about the medium itself. The breaking of the fourth wall, I argue, trends overwhelmingly towards this immersive storytelling. Inherently, fourth wall breaking calls attention to the medium the story is delivered through, whether that be a television screen, or a game controller, or even, in some pretty cool examples, the pages of a book. It demands the acknowledgement of the fiction in a way that immersive storytelling tends not to. The transgressive nature of immersive storytelling lends itself towards something else, too. Queer play. It isn't the mere act of transgressing that makes fourth wall breaking queer. It's the critical eye cultivated by immersive storytelling that creates queerness in the players. Take the Stanley Parable, for instance. In the Stanley Parable, the player is told at every step what decision they are meant to make in order to tell the story the narrator wants to tell. Going through the game according to these instructions results in an ironic tale about the player character, Stanley, learning to take control of his own life and make his own decisions, achieving freedom after years of doing exactly what he's told. Disobeying the narrator, though, causes any number of increasingly ridiculous scenarios in which the player and narrator argue, spite one another, try and often fail to make peace, and work with or against one another to improve the narrator's game. This push and pull with the narrator makes the player play consciously, always choosing their next step with purpose and considering how these choices affect the game itself. They're confronted with the idea of authorial intent, the question of what makes an ending or decision meaningful, the moral issue of transgression, and the ways in which resisting a mainstream narrative may be necessary, even when those in charge of said narrative claim the resistance is unfair to them. Regardless of the choices ultimately made, the player of games like the Stanley Parable is a more aware player, because they are forced to make their decisions actively. Even the act of conforming to the expectations must be carefully considered, and when players choose not to conform, to play spitefully against the narrator, they are empowered in their decision to do so. The breaking of the fourth wall, in the way these games implement it, is effectively a training simulation. It takes a story, gets the player emotionally invested, forces them to confront the text's fictionality, and gives them the motivation to problem solve for the narrative in ways that are outside the box. A player who has been captivated by the parasocial interaction of Undertale has a reason to find creative, peaceful solutions. A player invested in the Stanley Parable's tongue-in-cheek banter with the narrator wants to experiment with options they're told not to pick. A player that feels their choices over Nico's fate in One Shot matter is more likely to dig around in game files to make the narrative end differently. Queer play emerges when gamers utilize games as an outlet for their desire to question systems, to break the rules, to come at the whole thing backwards. A game that fosters this kind of play, then, even insists upon it, is cultivating a queer approach in its audience. Immersive storytelling also presents a possible solution to the criticisms levied at quote-unquote empathy games, a genre of video games with the central theme of generating empathy for characters by helping the player to, supposedly, experience what the character has experienced, feel what the character has felt. It is admirable to create art that helps people connect with one another. This is especially powerful when employed by marginalized creators to tell their own stories, either through nonfiction or autofiction. Players who are similarly marginalized may see themselves in the narrative and find comfort in a story that makes them feel less alone in their struggle. Players who are part of the majority group may learn from the experience and display a greater level of compassion for marginalized folks due to the emotional impact of the story. The genre, however, has been co-opted by people who see experiencing this empathy as a prize to be won, a trophy to be paraded around like evidence they've reached the end of their learning journey. I finally know what it's like to be a trans person, was the attitude that surrounded Anna Anthropy's game Dysphoria for a very long time. The cultural emphasis on immersion was, in part, to blame here. Players from a majority group seek to lose themselves in the story, to watch their own identity and their own privilege disappear into the fictionalized character of an oppressed person. But when a privileged gamer becomes a marginalized character, they succeed in ignoring their own privilege entirely, and the character merely becomes a vessel for the normative assumptions of the audience. Immersive storytelling, then, draws attention to this difference. Awareness of the player's potential privilege emerges from the demarcation of player and character. An effect of fourth wall breaking is a distancing effect, as conceived by German playwright Bertolt Brecht. Brecht wanted to prevent the audience from personally identifying with the characters of his plays, because his plays were a call to action. As Widgers phrases it, the goal was to communicate that the world, like the play, is constructed and, as such, changeable. In order to do so, he addressed the audience directly, alienating them by surprising acting and showing them the technical side of the production. Confronted with the manipulative qualities of the medium, the distancing effect kicks in. The passive spectator is forced into a critical, analytical frame of mind. This critical frame of mind is precisely what links immersive storytelling with queer play. The player recognizes, acknowledges, and accepts their own place outside the narrative, while simultaneously using this distance to enact change within the fiction. In this way, immersive, fourth-wall-breaking media is the ideal form for telling queer or otherwise marginalized stories. It fosters emotional engagement and remains captivating for the audience, while at the same time bringing awareness to the separation of player and character to inspire critical exploration and creative problem-solving in its players as a simulation of real-world change. Storytelling is difficult. How do you balance grabbing the audience's attention with implementing careful subtlety, telling a powerful, cohesive story with allowing for audience interpretation, utilizing the tried and true methods of a genre with innovation and exploration, nudging players in the right direction with giving them the freedom to make their own choices? It's tricky. I hope to see a future where queer and marginalized artists use their art to challenge not merely the societal norms in place, but the existence of societal norms at all. Viewers deserve to figure out for themselves whether or not they agree with the narrative they're being sold, but in order to do that, they must be trained to become aware of this narrative in the first place. Immersive video games are the perfect vehicle with which to teach players in this way. The interactivity of the ludic design, combined with the critically aware act of calling out the difference between player and character, is so beautifully inherently queer. I can only hope that more game developers realize the power that comes with forcing their players to confront the fictionality of the things they love. Because fiction is powerful, and it's powerful because it's fiction. You don't have to lose yourself within the story for it to mean something to you, for it to affect you. Take a good hard look at that fourth wall. Expand it, contract it, break it, build it, ignore it, accept it, whatever you like best. But love it. Incorporate it into your stories and into your life. You might be surprised what emerges. Bye.